Welcome to Small Practice Support Information Session number 35. In this Law Society of Ireland recording, Mark Lowry talks to Justin Purcell about the Smith & Williamson Survey of Law Firms 2021.
Listen, Mark, you're very welcome to join us.
Thank you.
I'm joined here at the Small Practice Information Session, unbelievably 35. And today we're going to be doing an overview of the 9th Annual Survey of the Law Firms in Ireland by Smith & Williamson. So Mark Lowry is responsible for commercial strategy at Smith & Williamson. So I'm really delighted to have him with us today to share with us his insights into the latest annual survey that was conducted in October of 2020. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'll share the screen so that people can hopefully see. And if there's a problem with what's on the screen, just let me know.
We're taking questions over chat. So if anybody wants to ask a question, obviously we've only got 30 minutes, but at the end, after about 20 minutes, we're going to sort of pause and ask for take on more questions. So Mark, over to you. And
thanks so much. I really appreciate that.
News.
Justin, and thanks so much for joining us today. And Justin, thanks to you and the Law Society for inviting us to present the findings of our survey. Hopefully some of you are aware of it, but those that aren't, hopefully you'll get to know it, and we really welcome your participation. So please get onto our website and register. Just three themes that are going to come through today. The first one is people, and there's a lot of aspects to the people side, but I think for firms in general, it's an area we need to have a think about, and what the long-term changes that might impact us as a result of the pandemic. Second thing is prioritization. So there's a difference in the market in terms of how progressive firms have reacted to the challenges. And we're going to maybe highlight some of those, and maybe you might think as a firm yourselves about what you're prioritizing. And finally, profitability and what actions firms have taken to preserve their profitability and improve their profitability going forward. So there are the three things. Just a little bit about Smith & Williamson. We're a top 10 accounting firm based in Dublin. We've a team here of over 120. We're part of Tilney Smith & Williamson, which is the third largest investment management firm in the UK and Ireland. And the Irish practice dates back to 1958 and would have been Oliver Freeney and company, famous Dublin footballer. So we provide the full range of accounting services, but particularly to legal firms, including practice accounting, M&A advisory, due diligence, partner wealth, and tax advice. And we have an active litigation support team. So if you have areas that you need accountants to work on in terms of litigation, we're happy to support you around that. So a little bit about the survey itself. It took place in September, October last year, and it's the 9th year we've been running the survey. And it really looks at the sector challenges and issues, and that's what we've been looking at over the last number of years. And typically the things that have come up is the war for talent, Brexit, fee pressure, technology. But those challenges now are still there, but they are double whammied by this COVID-19 pandemic. So the existential threat posed by that is sort of the overlay of all of the other issues. So you think of it in that context when we're talking about the sector outlook, performance, people, mergers and acquisitions, and technology. So while the pandemic has had a profound impact on issues like revenues and cash flow, and the people within our organizations, these long-term challenges haven't evaporated. So I think that's the theme I would like you to think about. So looking at the outlook of the sector over the last 12 months. So think about this as the sentiment. So you can see practitioners in the sector are looking at the overall sector and they're saying, well, where is sentiment going? And in the last 12 months, it's absolutely taken a dive. And also for the next 12 months. So if you're looking at improved, it's zero people said in looking back that it had improved, and very few people think the next 12 months was going to improve either. However, when we take a look at all firms versus the top 24 firms themselves, we can also see that firms are more optimistic and have better sentiment about their own performance looking forward than they do about the sector in general. And the reason for this is that firms have more control and understand what levers they can pull themselves in terms of the strategies they're implementing. So it's a more positive for firms themselves. What we're seeing is that they're more positive than they feel about the sector in general. However, uh, if you look at it, it has been a turnaround year on year compared to 2019. So sentiment has certainly reversed, but not as dramatically as it has for the sector in general. So just in terms of outlook and looking at this and maybe taking a look at what smaller firms are feeling versus larger firms. So larger firms in general are more optimistic than smaller firms. And I think that's interesting in itself. Uh, Profitability is heavier hit for smaller firms than it is for larger firms. And then looking forward, larger firms are also more positive than the market in general. So I think in terms of sentiment, it's sort of a two stories here. There's the story of the larger firms, primarily based in Dublin, primarily focused on the corporate market, versus those firms that are more exposed to local economies and the domestic economy in general. So I think this is something that has impacted on the sector to a greater extent than we expected.
So are you saying there,
Yes.
Mark, that smaller firms are being more affected than bigger firms, or is that too
Yes,
simple?
effectively, yeah, that the sentiment effectively for the smaller firms is that they feel more affected than the larger firms. So if you look at performance then, so we're looking at, again, this is, I think, an indicator between larger firms and smaller firms. So 2/3 of law firms saw their revenue decline. Again, it's to a greater extent that's impacting smaller firms than the larger firms. And again, when you look at the revenue impact, the larger firms are seeing a greater impact, or the smaller firms are seeing a greater impact on their revenues than the larger firms. As that pulls through to the profit line, more than half of firms are seeing their profits decrease. Again, that's to a greater extent is impacted on smaller firms than larger firms. And when we look at the smaller firms, you can see that the profit impact has been more than 20% versus the top 20 firms, where it's around the 10% mark. So at the time, and this is last September, October time, firms in the top 20 weren't seeing the push through from their revenues into profitability as being as heavy an impact as those smaller firms that responded to the survey. And we'll take a look at why that might be as we go through this. So in terms of the issues that firms were seeing over the next 3 years, and this is a longer term look, what are the things that firms are really concerned about out there? And it's pretty much across the board, regardless of whether you're a large firm or a small firms, the same issues are hitting. So the economy being the big one. How is the economy going to recover from the pandemic? How is the the exchequer going to afford the subsidies that are being paid into the market, and the hit on tax take? So that's sort of a more general and existential issue. In terms of the firms themselves, they're thinking about profitability, they're thinking about cash flow, and they're thinking about recruitment and retention still. However, in those issues, you're thinking what areas are hitting the smaller firms more? It's actually down to the managing the cash flow and pressure on fees. And this is interesting in itself, in that the larger firms don't seem to be seeing the fee pressure in the same way as we see that with smaller firms. Brexit at the time, obviously, there was a cliff edge coming up, and that was a concern at the time. Different concerns have emerged since, and obviously I'm not going to really discuss those today. In terms of recruitment and retention, it's very interesting. While that has eased off as an issue in general, the larger firms are still recruiting, or a good chunk of them are still recruiting. So therefore, that is still an issue for them. For smaller firms, that wasn't an issue. So what were firms doing? What actions did they take given this existential threat of a pandemic? So we were really surprised with the level of use of the temporary wage subsidy and layoffs in the market. If you look at the top firms and all firms, was used to a very large extent by the sector in general. However, it wasn't the only strategy that was undertaken. When you look at the operational strategies that were implemented, it was really about reducing costs, reducing the cost basis dramatically as possible. And that was right across the piece. So regardless of whether you were a large firm or a small firm, these were the actions that were taken. So reducing operation costs, that's, some of that's fairly straightforward. Changing business processes to become more efficient. So some of that is driven by having to work from home, for example. And I think one of the issues that I would say for smaller firms relative to the larger firms is that the larger firms did not stop their external market facing activities, increasing their sales efforts, targeting new markets, and introducing new services. So firms at the top end were more likely to take what I would call progressive strategies relative to retrenchment strategies. And I think this is one that smaller firms may look at as time goes on. If your competition is more active in the market, how are you going to respond to that? You need to put in some actions yourself around market activity.
That's a consistent theme that's coming through from our marketing information sessions. Claire Fanner was talking about that also in the marketing.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So I think the other piece is then, what were the actions the firms took, and to what extent did they take those actions? So firms reduced their staff numbers. Firms reduce their fee earner salaries. So for smaller firms, the fee earners are generally partners in the organization, and those firms may not have taken the action to the same extent as the larger firms, and we're going to see that in a moment. I think there's the one I was talking about, is that it's a tale of two markets. You've got 40% of the top 20 firms increasing staff numbers. And when you look at the number of practicing certificates issued by firm, you can see that Matheson had grown significantly over the last 12 months, for example. Okay, so that's just around your people side. So pay and reward, I think this is an interesting piece here, in that you can see that over time it was relatively stable. 14, 15, 16, 17. Very few firms reducing the number of staff, lots of firms growing, lots of firms remaining stable in any of those given years. And then the difference between 2019 and 2020, a huge number of firms decreasing their staff numbers, and very few firms, or less firms, increasing their staff numbers. So that's sort of a trend analysis over time, and it's a real indicator of what happened last year and how heavily firms were impacted. I think the other piece there around people is the idea of working from home. And I think yourself and myself, Justin, discussed this over the last number of days, is how likely are firms to adopt a more flexible working environment. And what we see is a difference between larger firms and smaller firms, with larger firms really probably having a more progressive approach to working from home 3 days or more. So you can see, if you look at the green lines there, that's the larger firms, and then the Marsala and pink lines are the smaller firms. So I think from a competitive point of view and in the long run, this probably means more competition for talent in the regions, as larger firms are more willing to employ people who work remotely. So maybe that traditional source of employees coming from larger firms who now wish to change their lifestyle and move back to the regions, that might be something that's affected by this in the long run. So something firms need to take on.
So this is a perceived threat, maybe, in the.
I think a potential threat out there. It doesn't.
Employees, yeah.
Exactly. So for and I'm not going to say which firms, but if I'm working in one of the top 5 firms now, and I thought, I want to change my lifestyle, I want to move back where I came from, am I going to maintain my employment, or is there a possibility of doing that? Probably there is, whereas before I might have moved to a regional firm. or set up myself. The impact on pay, I think, is, and I think this is a slide that's well worth sharing, because it gives you a real indication of what's happened to salaries. So if we look at the increases right across the board, you had three quarters of firms in 2019 increasing salaries, and that dropped to only 25%. Now you got to remember, the survey would have happened in October. The pandemic didn't hit till March, so some firms would have had early pay reviews before the pandemic hit, and that may be the reason for this happening. The indication we've had is that very few firms increased salaries post the pandemic hitting. I think if you look at bigger firms versus smaller firms, and again, this is an indication of how radical the large firms got about managing their cash, and probably a reason they were able to maintain their profit line, is 60% of large firms decreased salaries, and when they decreased them by more than 6%. So you had radical decreases in salaries happening for employees relative to smaller firms, where those decreases were less and not as radical, although 21% of firms did engage in 10% plus reductions. So again, I think this is an indication of the appetite for radical action for larger firms relative to smaller firms. So mergers and acquisitions, this is an area for us that, you know, we're consistently surprised that there are not as many mergers in this sector as perhaps in our own sector, the accountancy sector. So LLPs are in. So there's a limitation on liability for firms that have more than two partners if they've applied to the LSRA for the limited liability and have met the criteria. There's a couple of things. We still think it's underutilized by firms. There's not as many of them applying as we would have thought would apply. And secondly, in Dublin, it's hasn't been adopted as quickly as we would have thought. We would have thought more Dublin firms would have gone for it earlier. I think there's a little bit of waiting and seeing in the market, and even some of the larger firms haven't gone for it. The other piece then is that there's an appetite for M&A in the market, and that's right across large firms and small firms. So firms are out asking someone to dance, but not many people are dancing, I think is how I would put it. So there's a lot of hunger to get involved in an M&A, but not a lot of transactions happening out of that.
Do you see any particular reason for that, Mark? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at professional services firms, it's often difficult to get the culture fit right. The management of the firms in some cases isn't all it should be. Due diligence tends to uncover things that maybe we're not comfortable with in terms of risk. But primarily it's down to an issue of control. Larger firms tend to do this more successfully, and there have been a few mergers and acquisitions. I think Flynn O'Driscoll pulled in somebody last year, and Philip Blees as well. But they tend to be by way of addressing the issue of succession for smaller firms going into larger firms where there's an opportunity to do that. I think for smaller firms, it is a more difficult thing because it's that area of control. Effectively, if I'm one or two partners running a firm, I have a lot of control over work and everything else. If I bring in more partners, it can be more complicated. So really, it's down to an appetite there. We would see it as a long-term issue for the sector because, really succession becomes difficult if you haven't addressed that early doors, and maybe we can discuss that afterwards. Let's just say the UK firms not approaching the market in the same way as they did before. Essentially, those that had a Brexit strategy for entering the European market probably already have. So there still are some looking to put a foothold in the Irish market, but there's a complexity now in that partners in UK firms can no longer be a partner in an Irish firm following the 31st of December. So that's causing issues as to how they might enter the market. Lateral hires is the big thing in the market, and if you look at the top firms and how they've grown over the last 12, 18 months. In particular, lateral hires has been the way. So the Irish solution to an Irish problem of M&A activity not happening is effectively to do M&A by the back door of hiring an entire team in without having to take on the entire firm. I think interesting is the growth of the international firms, and that's primarily through lateral hire. So if you look at Pinsent Masons, DAC Beechcroft, who are now top 20 firms with aspirations to become top 10 firms. These firms continue to grow, continue to increase the number of practicing certificates that they have and the number of lawyers that they have within their firm. So I would see them as an ongoing threat to the larger firms rather than regional and smaller firms. So technology and cybersecurity, again, remote working is the thing that dominates here, and that's not surprising. With that, being the key piece that firms are saying they're going to invest in. Again, some of the other areas are what I would call operational or strategies to increase your efficiency, and that's around document management, managing workflows. And then if you start to look at what the larger firms are doing, the larger firms are doing things like looking at enhancing their digital brand, creating new service models, pricing analytics, and enhancing client experience. And they've been sort of ahead of the game in terms of that market-facing strategies in terms of their technology investment. And we've pointed out over the last number of years sort of a tale of two markets where there's a significant cohort of large firms investing heavily in technology, not just to improve their efficiency, but also to improve their market presence, how they deal with clients, and effectively could leave behind smaller firms. We don't have the wherewithal to invest in that. However, there are going to be off-the-shelf solutions. So artificial intelligence was the big piece that had been talked about over the last number of years. That's really fallen off the radar as the cost of entry into that has been very, very significant, and really in the purview of only a very few large firms, even internationally. However, as time goes on, there will be more off-the-shelf solutions for firms. So maybe a wait-and-see attitude might help in terms of being able to buy software rather than having to invest in creating it. Again, technology, and I think this is an area where I'd sort of say, remote working was the big one, but I think cybersecurity, and you're going to run a series of webinars in March around cybersecurity. I think it's really important. What I'd say is for the legal sector, it's a bit of head in the sand for smaller firms relative to larger firms. So only 28% of firms were saying that they were subject to a cyber attack. I have to say, I've been phished 3 or 4 times in the last month. So I would be really surprised if it's not 100% of firms and 100% of lawyers that aren't subject to some sort of cyber attack at some point during the year. So slight underreporting. Underreporting to us is indicative of probably a lack of awareness or lack of really looking at this as something that's really important and potentially threatening to you, your career, and your livelihood. So it's really important that you might look at that, because it's human behavior to a large extent rather than systems that these hackers really utilize. Of the firms that were subject to cyber attack, 10% of them suffered a significant impact. Now, significant impact was up to 3-4 days out where they were no longer able to provide service from their office. So that can be really difficult situation. I think what I would say is every single one of those firms that was affected was a small firm, wasn't one of the larger firms. So the larger firms have got the systems and the human behavior piece really wrapped up. And when they are hit, and they are hit to a larger extent, they don't suffer negative impacts. It's more likely if you're a smaller firm, you're going to suffer a negative impact, and that's possibly because you're not prepared. So I would say those sessions in March are an essential.
We'll bring up those sessions later for people to have a view of.
Excellent. So look, guys, I think the sector was aligned as to what it wanted to do: protect jobs, ensure that their clients were well serviced, and helping the firm survive. They were the 3 things that were out there. And I think, when we looked at that was really positive in terms of the sector itself. But I think, again, a tale of two cities here in terms of what's happened. So top 20 firms were more likely to take more radical action relative to smaller firms to preserve cash flow and to give themselves some wiggle room as the pandemic progressed. So they were doing things like, reducing the overhead, but to a greater extent, making wage reductions, but again, to a greater extent. So more firms doing more radical action. So what's the lesson in this for smaller firms is that those firms that are at the large end were willing to take these radical actions, and perhaps in your planning forward, you might think about, if there is impacts like this or an existential threat that comes along, that immediate and radical action rather than a wait and see approach might be more fruitful. Now, if we thought the confidence was hit here, our UK colleagues are delusioned. So this was taken last summer. Brexit was on its way in the UK, and pandemic was in full flight. And again, they are massively positive over there. So we feel that the UK relative to Ireland is less realistic in terms of its outlook going forward. And that was just one I wanted to share with you as we went forward. So look, just to wrap up, a couple of key takeaways I think are really important. Yes, it's a new time, and it is time to think about what your new strategies forward are. So we'd be thinking about things like leadership, how you manage your organization, what your business continuity plans are, what your decision making is in a crisis, because there is no doubt crisis will come along again. They happened in 2008. We've had it here in 2020, and there will be a future crisis. So what are your plans and what actions are you going to take? And we feel that larger firms have professionalized to a greater extent over the last number of years, putting in place HR teams, putting in place finance teams, and able to manage these things in a more professional way because they're not as involved in the day-to-day running, the day-to-day client interactions. Remote working, IT infrastructure and investment around that is going to be absolutely essential. And if we are to compete, I think, against some of these Goliaths, how do we do that? We've got to be more flexible in terms of our working, a better place to work than our colleagues in the larger firms. Business development is really threatened, and this is an area I work in all the time. We don't have breakfast seminars, the local chamber of commerce. You're not able to meet with your colleagues. How are you going to do that in a world that's all online? Team learning and development for those firms like ourselves that are firms that take in graduate recruits and bring them through on a professional career. How are we going to do that in a way when we can't sit in an office with them? And I think we really have to think about that. Motivation of your team and maintaining your firm culture, really important, and something we see as something that needs to be invested in. And hopefully, as we get a chance to work in offices as time goes on, we'll be able to do that. But we've got to think about that in a world where remote working is becoming more the norm.
Here's one for you, Mark. Just on the survey questions, we're coming up to the end here now. So if anyone has any other questions, is what percentage of the survey did small firms participate in? Because it does seem that some of the conclusions are slightly larger firm heavy. Would that be fair? And then the second question,
so you think about
the last two questions at the one time. The second is,
sure.
What are the learnings specifically for smaller firms that out of this?
Okay, so large firms, there's 15 of the top 20 took part. This year the survey was slightly down in number, so 87 was the overall number. And again, that was down to essentially businesses not being available, so people working from home.
So what percentage of that would be smaller firms, do you think?
So of the smaller firms, I think it was in mid-size, which is 5+ partners, that was in the 35, and then about 35 were small firms. So it's firms with 5+ partners and firms with less than 5 partners. So that was the vast majority of the survey in terms of numbers. So it's about 70% of the survey.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the second question, sorry, I didn't get it there.
That was just what are the takeaways really for small firms out of all of this? In brief, like what are the growing areas? What are the areas where they can have the most impact on? Is it that they can operate remotely? They can be more flexible with their workforce?
Yeah, I think the key thing is flexibility. You're smaller and you're more flexible. At the same time, you're more vulnerable. So I think there is you need to look at scale and you need to look at longevity. So if you're a very small practice, if you're a sole practitioner, I think there's certainly a benefit in looking at what your long-term plans are. Ultimately, very small firms will find it very difficult to exit in a way that you'll be able to sell your practice. It'll be easier if you think about getting some scale, having a few partners in, and developing a team going forward, so that as your career progresses, your team progress, and that you can step out ultimately and retire. I think that's something that firms need to think about. I think scale also gives the opportunity to specialize and to really think about those areas that you can compete with some of those larger firms. A lot of the market, the larger firms aren't competing in to the same extent. So you know your local market better than they do. You're in your local market, you're part of that community. Your business development strategy needs to be aligned with that. I think your team culture and bringing your team forward are going to be a really important part of that, and being more flexible and being a better employer effectively than the larger employers. And that doesn't mean that you have to pay more. I'm aware of a firm here in Dublin. They're not in the legal sector, but it's a firm called Thinscale, and they have all of their staff working remotely all around the country. And geography isn't important to where those employees are. I would say I've employees in Belfast and employees in Newry at the moment, where we never had before, where those individuals commuted from Dundalk or north of Dublin, and they've moved back to where they've to their parents' house, actually, in those cases. So look, flexibility is all part of it. I think the other piece is in terms of cash flow and cash flow management, really important for firms, and we've seen that slip in the last year. It's very difficult, we think.
Listen,
for
Mark,
partners.
I'm afraid we're going to have to draw to a close. We've just run out of time. So I suppose the main takeaways are the bigger firms took drastic action, made their decisions up front, concentrate on current marketing, be flexible with your workforce, an eye on the future as to how you're going to exit the business and how to build scale. So I think it's been really informative, really great to talk to you today.
Excellent.
We'll be sending out a recording of the show today to everybody, and hopefully with some sort of a copy of the slides. And I'll give you some of the dates for those cybersecurity. We've got 3 dates in March where we're really focusing in on cybersecurity, which I think is a really important area. So listen,
excellent.
Thanks very much. You've been great with us. Great to impart your knowledge with us today. And to everyone out there, Sloan, and thanks for participating.